nervous because I'm here now.
Hey guys, welcome into another episode of 410 Sports Talk. I'm James Haskell, along with my co-host Glenn Martin. Really excited to preview the Baltimore Ravens Tennessee Titans game with our new guest in front of the show, Crissy Froyd, who covers LSU and Tennessee Titans for USA Today Sports Media Group. So Crissy, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We're really excited to get your insight here. So Glenn, I'm gonna let you kick it off and start with the questions.
All right. Well, thanks again, Crissy, for coming on with us. When I think about the Titans, I think about that great playoff run, how they were the underdogs, and it bothers me a little bit because I can't think too hard because that was a tough night as a Ravens fan. But I still even after that, that upset and coming into the season, starting off with the hot streak, it still feels like the Titans are one of the more overlooked and underrated teams in the league. Do you agree with that? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, one thing about the Titans, though, because I did grow up a Titans fan. I mean, my fandom is kind of, I don't know, when you become a journalist, it kind of peters out, I guess, to a certain extent. But one thing that you always realize if you've watched the Titans for as long as I have is just the inconsistency. If it's not there, it's coming, which is why whenever this team started out undefeated 5-0, it was like, this is probably the most consistent that we've seen them. And then they started dropping those games and it was like, there it is. But I mean, I think that they're in a place where they could get their feet back under them. I think that this is another chance for a get right game, that kind of the way that the Chicago one was. But I mean, the Titans, they're a little bit overlooked just because they're not consistently good. They're not consistently dominant. They've had a lot of playoff runs where they've just kind of barely edged their way in. And this is not a flashy team. I mean, this is something that me and Sean Salisbury were talking about, is there's not a whole lot of wow factor. They kind of manhandle you on the ground. Very physical football team. They're at their best when they get down to the basics, down to the fundamentals, like things like that. So I feel like because they lack that flashiness and because they're not a consistently dominant powerhouse, though they do have really great standout players on both sides of the ball, I think that's why we find this team being overlooked so often.
Yeah, that's interesting to me because I feel like, pre-Lamar Jackson, the Ravens were usually in that boat, just very similar to what you described, where outside of here, no one really had too much faith or understanding because there wasn't much national media coverage. So it's really interesting to know that not the only team suffering from those things. But, when you're talking about the Titans, much like the Ravens, had to deal with season-long injuries, of course, to their Pro Bowl left tackle, Taylor Lewan. How are the Titans dealing with, him being out for the remainder of the season, and how much has losing him affected this offense overall?
Well, I think to lose a player like that is really a huge blow. I think we've seen the Titans really kind of shift a good bit within the offensive line just throughout recent years. But I mean, to lose a guy like Taylor Lewan, that's a guy that's hard to replace. But I also think it's hard to ignore in some areas the depth that the Titans do have within the offensive line. But when you lose someone who is so key, and it's really, to me, just regardless of position, you're going to go through an adjustment period after that person is gone. And I don't think that that's the only thing factoring into the Titans kind of being on a little bit of a skid right now. But I do think that it's one of those things that the offense and the team just as a whole has to adjust to, has to make up for, maybe has to change a few things. Someone has to be stronger than the other in a way that they didn't have to be before. But I think that the Titans, they've been a little bit lackluster on offense lately, in my opinion. I think that Ryan Tannehill is still someone who's very efficient. I think he's definitely the best quarterback that this team has had in a long time. But I mean, even him, it just, what he's done the past couple of games hasn't really wowed anybody. So I think that the Titans kind of need to get back to finding just a little bit more rhythm and correcting some mistakes on offense.
And to further that, what is the overall health of the Titans right now? I saw Adoree Jackson, looks like he missed practice, as well as Clowney. How are the Titans coming in this game from a health standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it could be better. I think the Ravens are worse off in that aspect, if we really look at it. But I think that's something that's been kind of something that's impacted every team this year. I mean, between the reserve COVID-19 list and guys getting injured, especially toward the beginning of the season, that's kind of been more of a league-wide problem, really.
Yeah, and one of the things that Glenn and I were mentioning before we came on the show is that, there's so many 6-3 teams right now. Of course, the Ravens and Titans now second in their division, tied at 6-3. It appears that two teams will definitely be competing to grab one of those 3 wild card spots. How important could this game prove to be later in the year when it comes to that playoff seeding, as well as who's in and who's not?
Yeah, this game definitely has playoff implications. I think that whoever wins this one is really going to have a lot more of an upper hand. And I think it's interesting just to the way that this matchup could go. I mean, we don't really know because both of these teams are struggling right now. We have one that's lost the past 2 or 3, and one that's lost 3 of their past 4 as well. And then we have the injury bug kind of on both sides, and then we have both quarterbacks not really performing to the best of their potential. So I think that it's hard to make a prediction on this game. I know the Ravens are favored by a touchdown. I think it could come down to really either team by a touchdown. It's going to be who can step up in somebody else's place. And I think that depending on if Lamar Jackson or Ryan Tannehill can really, I guess, find themselves again, can get back to playing at their top potential. I think that's going to kind of determine who wins this game, but I don't think that anyone expected Derrick Henry and the Titans to absolutely throttle the Ravens like they did last year. So It is really going to be interesting to see how this one plays out. And I really think it could go either way, but yes, it absolutely has playoff implications.
And one guy I want to talk about is probably one of their more overlooked guys and under the radar guys on offense is tight end Jonnu Smith. I was fortunate enough to grab him in fantasy.
Brag about
football.
your boy.
I'm just saying I was able to find that diamond in the rough and grab him in fantasy football, and it's paid off. He's got 6 touchdowns already this season. What makes Jonnu Smith such a matchup problem, and how do the Titans like to use him?
I mean, it comes down to versatility. We've seen the Titans use Jonnu Smith in quite a few ways. I think that maybe even one time, I can't remember which game it was, but I think that I saw him throw a block and I was like, oh, wow, this is a little bit interesting to watch. And then I think that he took a handoff too. So he's a guy that the Titans can employ in several ways. He's also a guy that I absolutely roasted whenever he was first taking Delanie Walker's place because he was frustrating. I mean, he was frustrating to watch because he laid a goose egg like every single game there for a while. And there was a point in time I was like, when are they going to finally cut this guy? Like, he is good for absolutely nothing. And Delanie Walker and I actually had a conversation about Jonnu Smith one time, and of course, he spoke to his work ethic and him just working really hard to rise in his place, because Delanie Walker at one point was really like the only weapon that the Titans have. And I feel bad for all the quarterbacks like Zach Benberger who had to struggle with that. But I think that he's a guy who's really, really impressed everyone, just given how low the expectations were for him, especially at that one period of time. But I think that he's grown, and I think that he's grown consistently, and he's absolutely one of the bigger weapons that the Titans do have on this offense, and I think he'll only continue to grow in that role.
Yeah, you touched earlier on Ryan Tannehill, and of course he's one of the best stories in the NFL in our opinion. You know, with what he's been able to accomplish since he took over a quarterback, you know, being kind of tossed to the side in Miami and traded for a box of rocks. You know, why has he found so much success in Tennessee? And the other question I have to that is, you know, what type of leader is he? Is he the type of guy that team has really gotten behind as their quarterback?
Yeah, I mean, as far as some quarterbacks go, I think that some of them can only function well in certain systems. And I think that Ryan Tannehill has gotten lucky in the fact that he was able to leave Miami by circumstance, and then he was able to immediately go there to a system that did fit him. And I think that that's shown in Tennessee, because last year I was impressed, but I was cautiously impressed because I knew how inconsistent that Tannehill has shown to be in the past. But I think now that we're at this point in the season and how just consistent overall, that's not to say that there haven't been some mistakes or some things that he'd probably like to go back and change. But I think for the most part, he's kind of kept his foot on the gas ever since he's been here. And I mean, it's huge. NFL Comeback Player of the Year. He's done a lot in Tennessee, and I think that he's going to continue to grow upon that. And I think that as far as the leadership thing goes, I mean, I think that these guys are happy to play with Tannehill. I think that they're happy to have him as their leader. And I think that more than anything, they're probably happy to have some success consistently on offense, and to have a quarterback who is in there that's not going to switch up with somebody else. And because for so long we saw the Titans switching back and forth between all these quarterbacks, and then not just with starters, but we had starters getting injured, and then it was the guy behind him, and then you had guys like Blaine Gabbert who came in and just weren't competent, to put it bluntly.
Yeah, poor Blaine Gabbert. Well, the Titans, much like the Ravens, were active at the trade deadline, bringing cornerback Desmond King over from the Chargers. I'm curious as to why that move. Was cornerback a huge area of need, and why King specifically?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with just things like injury and then having to improve that secondary. I mean, we saw Christian Fulton. I think that he was on the reserve list or injured reserve for a little while, and then Adoree Jackson as well. So I think it just comes down to bolstering the secondary, which did have some issues at a point in time this year.
So the other thing we want to talk to you about is special teams. We've kind of focused on defense and offense, but here in Baltimore, we're special teams proud. With that, we think that we have the best pair of kicking specialists, of course, between Justin Tucker and Sam Cook. I know the Titans have had their ups and downs kicking this season with, of course, former Patriots kicker Gostowski now handling kicking duties. How confident are the Titans if this game comes down to a last-second field goal and his ability to get the job done?
Well, I think if it comes down to a last-second field goal, they're going to want to make sure that guy is as far away from the goalpost as he possibly can be. You've heard about that, haven't you? How he's better from far away than he is up close.
It's crazy.
Yeah, there was a joke about that. I think I can't remember if it was a 46-yarder or how long of the exact numbers in the attempt that he missed. But when I look at that guy, I mean, his highs are very high. He totally bails the team out, or his lows are very low, and he is ultimately, like, if we're looking play by play, the reason why the Titans were not able to win the game. So he's such a wild card. It's hard to form an opinion on him because he's either the hero or he's like the black sheep, the one that lost the game. And then we talked about, you mentioned punters. I think that having Brett Kern out really sucks for this team, because even when the Titans were so inconsistent all the time, it was like strong and steady Brett Kern. That was like the guy that I looked to. Like, we would have to write. There was a certain article back. I'm not the editor of the Titans division anymore. I just contribute there now. But we would have to write like the players that impressed that game, and then the ones that kind of fell short. And if it was a really, really bad game, you always knew that you could put Brett Kern on there. It's kind of funny whenever you look to see like, looking at this team, like who are the consistently good players, and you have to go and keep looking at the punter. So, I mean, the Titans, they've had some special teams issues throughout the past, especially at place kicker last year. And it looks like that problem is not completely remedied this year. So, yeah, I mean, I would give the upper hand in special teams to the Ravens for sure.
Well, you shouldn't feel like you guys are alone as far as not having anyone else to write about when it comes to a good game other than the punter, because before we got Lamar Jackson, we have to lead the league in jerseys sold for a kicker. Like, there are so many.
Crissy. He was our superstar. It's
insane. You walk in the stadium, you see number 9 everywhere. It's like, who's this guy? He's the kicker. It's crazy to me.
Yeah, and I don't know how Gostkowski made it past week 1. I remember week 1. He missed 4 consecutive kicks, and you mentioned how they were mostly short, and one of which was an extra point. I was stunned that they stuck with the guy. Usually if a kicker like that, he's cut the very, that same night. Much less keep him to this point. So were you surprised that they stuck with Gostkowski throughout the season?
I mean, a little bit, especially considering all the shuffling we saw at the position last season as they just kept trying to figure out who was going to come in and who was actually going to be good. I mean, maybe at that point, you almost kind of start to lose hope a little bit. But I think that the veteran experience might have a little bit to do with it as well, because he's someone that you would look at and think should, in theory, be reliable. And like I said, not consistently reliable, but he's gotten the job done a few times. So, I mean, do we eventually see the Titans part ways with him? Perhaps. I wouldn't be surprised. But yeah, that first performance was absolutely awful. It was almost just unreal, just unbelievable to see how many consecutive kicks that he missed.
Go ahead, Jimmy.
No, I was just going to say, we're talking about the kicker, but I think really the star of the show is King Henry, of course. at the end of the day. At least that's, once again, outside looking in. That's who the national media focuses on. Everyone talks about his stiff arm, his size, his violent, running style. But aside from what people see and what the national media talks about, is there anything that, as a person that covers them closely, is there anything that's special about his game that makes him such a unique running back that maybe isn't talked about enough?
Well, I think that it's talked about, but I think the fact that he's just so big and powerful and so hard to tackle. I mean, you see a lot of good running backs in this league, but it's hard to find a running back that is that big, that can move that efficiently, and that is going to be that hard to bring down. And I think that just going up against that is a nightmare for just about every defense. It's something that no matter how good your defense is, it comes down to literally an issue of just size and power, and that you're not used to going up against someone who is that just that big.
Yeah, it sucks.
He is terrifying. There's no doubt about that.
Ask Earl Thomas.
Yeah, it's crazy to see a running back who is always bigger than the linebacker trying to tackle him, which is just not something you're used to seeing. But yeah, at 6'3", I mean, I remember the picture he had next to who's the little
Mark Ingram.
No, who's the third down back? And Dion Lewis, I think it was, in Tennessee. They had a picture next to each other, and he's a foot taller than him. I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
But so talking specifically about this game, if you had to point to maybe just one thing, what do you say the Titans need to do to get a victory against Baltimore?
Come up with turnovers and keep Lamar Jackson thrown off. There was some decision making that was a little bit wonky last game, I think, for Lamar Jackson, especially with that one really bad interception. And you saw how close that game came down to, just score wise. So I think that when you look at a game where the winner is favored by a touchdown, and you kind of look at the circumstance, you can tell that it's going to be a close one. And usually when it comes down to close games like that with teams that both have issues that are struggling, that really need to get right and get back on track again, it could come down to the very end with whoever wins the turnover battle, honestly. Whichever quarterback can make the right decisions and can stay steady throughout the game.
Yeah, it's interesting because we've been talking about, as we were prepping for Patriots Week, we were talking about not having to win the game, but not losing the game, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's going to be interesting to see which quarterback blinks first and makes a mistake, because that could end up being the determining factor. So that's a great point. All right, Crissy, we're going to put your feet to the fire here. Now, some people we've had on, they have a weekly, article or video, whatever the case may be, in which they give their prediction. But if you're able to, at this point, being that it's a Wednesday evening, are you able to provide us with your prediction of the outcome? What do you think's going to happen?
I would say probably 27-20 Baltimore in this one.
Wow.
So
all right. A lot of people,
the odds makers get it right, I guess. If that's because the spread's what, 7 now? I think it's something like that. Yeah. Okay. All right. So it should be a good one. Well, Crissy, thanks a lot for coming on. Why don't you let the fans and listeners know where they can find you and what you're working on?
Yeah. So I'm Crissy_Froyd on Twitter. That's pretty much the only place that I really post my work. And then we pretty steadily pump out content on Titans Wire and LSU Wire, which are obviously the LSU division and the Tennessee Titans division of USA Today Sports Media Group. And then here and there, I'll have like little video segments that I kind of just do myself. And then what I do over at Pro Football Network and high school football every once in a while. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
That's awesome. That's pretty much it. Like, she's not doing 1,000 things. That's awesome. We appreciate the time. Have a great evening, and we will talk soon.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks,
yep.
Crissy.